In the 21st century, those who change the world are those who change the culture. They get people in sync, lead tribes, create movements, and generate an energy field where ordinary people achieve extraordinary results.
If your tactical performance is how well you've learned from the past, how well you've codified the past, how well you stick to the plan, the second half of performance is adaptive performance. And this is how well you diverge from the plan. When your plan doesn't have an answer, can you and your organization innovate, be creative, be inventive? Is your company stuck in time, or is it constantly pushing the boundaries on how it does work? And what's really interesting about tactical and adaptive performance is that they're opposites. If you emphasize one too much in your life or in your organization or your team, you start to destroy the other.
I'm Aga Bayer, and this is the CultureLab podcast, where you will find ideas and inspiration on how to harness the power of team and organizational culture. I talk to leadership thinkers, culture experts, entrepreneurs, and all sorts of movers and shakers, and together we explore the fascinating topic of culture, leadership, and personal growth. If you like what you hear, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Or better yet, write a review on iTunes and share the podcast with your followers and friends on social media. For more, check out our archive at www.agabayer.com/podcast. Hi, and welcome to episode 39. My guest today is Lindsay McGregor. She's the co-author of the New York Times bestselling book, Primed to Perform: How to Build the Highest Performing Cultures Through the Science of Total Motivation. Lindsay is also the CEO and co-founder of Vega Factor. It's a company that's based in New York and that helps organizations build high-performing operating models and cultures. I really enjoyed speaking to Lindsay, and I think it's partially because she's just such a nice person, but also because her insights regarding culture and motivation were so enlightening. I know that they will be incredibly useful to anyone who works in a company and to anyone who wants to create a high-performing culture. Enjoy. Welcome to CultureLab, Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Aga, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. I'm really excited to have you too. And for those of our listeners who don't know you, could you just share a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes, so I am the author of a book called Primed to Perform and the co-founder and CEO of a company named Vega Factor. And all of our work is around how do you build a high-performing culture? And can you build a business case around it so you can measure its impact? I love to learn and read and research culture, but I spend most of my time rolling up my sleeves, working with organizations, helping them transform who they are and how they work.
Fantastic. And I know that a lot of our listeners are really interested in building high performance cultures. So I can't wait to dive into that topic. But before we go there is one question that I ask all our guests, because I'm really curious about what were the early cultural influences that shaped people really early on in their childhood. So how about you? What shaped you as a person? What made Lindsay Lindsay?
When I was a child, I grew up in a home that believed deeply that if you put your mind to anything, you could accomplish it. And that if you saw a problem in the world and you didn't like the way it was being solved, the way something was being done, my mom would always say, it's your job to go and fix it. Stop complaining about everybody else, just go do it. And while I think that was really powerful, one of my first work experiences turned a lot of that on its head for me, where I saw all of these incredibly good, dedicated, determined people trying their hardest, believing they could accomplish things and failing because of these big systematic culture issues that they didn't know how to solve. And so it was this really interesting moment for me early in work that I thought if I grit my teeth and bear it, I can get through anything. And then I saw there's a difference between working hard and working smart, and we didn't yet know how to work smart on culture. So that was really one of the defining moments for me in my career is how do I solve this problem? Because there's so many great people working on it and we feel like we're butting our head against a wall.
Thank you for sharing this story. And I think a lot of our listeners actually can identify with that experience of being in a way almost, like pulled by a gravitational force that sort of drags them down all the time. And I have a feeling, especially after reading your book, Primed to Perform, that before we can talk about how to build a high-performing culture, it would be good to talk about individual performance and motivation first. And I want us to start with performance, because I think that this is where your first breakthrough came when you were trying to figure out what drives a high-performing culture. Is that correct?
Yeah, that sounds great. We actually started to research how do you create a great culture and a high-performing culture without crystallizing what we meant by performance. We just had these long, long lists on whiteboards of every good quality you've ever heard. We want people to be proactive and innovative and responsible and take ownership. And we really had our first breakthrough in the research when we realized that these sprawling whiteboard lists could be boiled down into two concepts. That when people talk about high performance, they really mean two things. The first is tactical performance. And this is everything that helps you stick to the plan. It's everything that creates convergence in your organization. So for example, do you have a standard process for solving this problem or carrying out this task? And does everybody know that process? And does everybody follow it? And does everybody have personal to-do lists to help them stay on track? And those processes are the way that you, as an organization, have codified all of your past learning so that you don't have to have people reinventing the wheel, which is a huge waste of time or frustrating. You don't have to have people making the same mistake twice. You feel like you've got this incredible foundation to stand on because of all the past learnings of your company. But if your tactical performance is how well you've learned from the past, how well you've codified the past, how well you stick to the plan, the second half of performance is adaptive performance. And this is how well you diverge from the plan. When your plan doesn't have an answer, can you and your organization innovate, be creative, be inventive? Is your company stuck in time, or is it constantly pushing the boundaries on how it does work? And what's really interesting about tactical and adaptive performance is that they're opposites. If you emphasize one too much in your life or in your organization or your team, you start to destroy the other.
So can you give us a few examples of what can happen when you focus too much on the tactical performance?
Yeah, absolutely. Early in my career, I got to work in a lot of big call centers, customer service call centers. Mm-hmm. And you'd walk into these buildings that were the size of soccer fields or football fields. And it would be rows and rows and rows of gray cubicles with people sitting there who felt like they were being treated like robots, interchangeable, completely replaceable. And these call centers had amazing tactical performance. You would have process charts. Everybody had laminated checklists on their desk that said exactly how they were supposed to respond to a customer comment and route a question.
It really sounds like hell to me.
Sometimes it's great because you're like, great, I don't have to figure out how to do all this stuff. Somebody's just given me their cheat sheet, right? Like imagine your best friend had a cheat sheet of all the shortcuts to using your computer. You'd say, thank goodness I don't have to learn that all myself.
Sure.
So some of it's good.
Yeah.
But you could take it so far, which is where I think you're anticipating this going already, as to script out everything that you want everyone to say at all times.
Yeah.
And we all can feel how painful that is for the individual working in that environment. But we also all know that that's not what the customer wants either.
That's right. Yeah, well, I think we've all been at the receiving end of that. And it's really horrible when you feel that you are not really speaking to a human being. You are just, someone's reading a script out and there is no connection there.
Exactly. And so the organization has created this tactical machinery because they want to make the organization higher performing and the people higher performing. But ironically, it does the opposite. And so then organizations swing the pendulum from super tactical to super adaptive. They say, well, just do whatever you want. But my guess is you've also called a customer service center where you ask 3 different representatives the same exact question and you get 3 completely different answers. Not sure if you've ever been in those shoes.
Yeah, well, it happens. It's true.
And then
especially in Italy, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, then the customer gets really frustrated. They say, why don't you have processes and systems and consistency? What's wrong with you? And that doesn't make the customer service representative on the other end of the line feel any better either. And
right. So how do you find a middle ground there? Because I think what you're driving at is that none of the two, if done excessively, is the answer to a high performance culture, but somehow you want to keep a balance. And I'm sure that our listeners would be curious to know what can they do to keep the right balance between the two?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we found that, first, when people are defining their cultures, they often don't help people realize that they define the culture. They don't help people realize that a great culture has both. And so what people expect, for example, we do a lot of work in Silicon Valley with engineers and startups, and their assumption is that, when you're small and you're young, it's all adaptive performance. It must all be exciting. And there is no way to avoid the fact that as we grow and scale, we're going to become all tactical and bureaucratic. And therefore, I'm going to have to quit my job and find the next startup. And so people think that's inevitable. And so the first thing in balancing the two is teaching people that one's not good, one's not bad. You can have both. And that actually feels really good for you, for your whole culture, and for your customer. So it's breaking that misconception.
One of the examples that you give in your book is of Starbucks and an employee there who had a little bit of trouble sort of really getting the Starbucks culture. And I think that in companies like that, where you really need to follow certain rules, certain SOPs, standard operating procedures, like latte has to taste in the same way in every Starbucks, probably around the globe. So what is the space for people to be adaptive within those constraints of having to be consistent and having a lot of standard operating procedures?
Yeah, I love that story because this Starbucks employee was exactly as you said. Starbucks has to have this consistent experience. The latte has to taste the same in Japan and Italy and the US. And what this young employee of Starbucks said is, what I expected at work is that when I showed up, I would be taught, here are all the rules that I'm not allowed to break, and here are all the things that I must do. But he had a really talented manager who, her mission was that her Starbucks would be a home away from home for people in her community that was welcoming to anyone, no matter who you were, what you looked like, who you identified with. And what she said to him is, you have no flexibility in these areas. Like, this is the tactical performance that matters to our customers. But here are the areas where it is okay to experiment. Here are the areas where I do want you to be adaptive. And he was naturally quite a grumpy kind of fellow. His sense of humor was
you don't use that word in the book, but
his sense of humor was very wry, sarcastic, grumpy. He looks much more like a lumberjack, like comfortable by himself in the middle of a field than at a Starbucks. And so she said, the most important place you can adapt to to help us accomplish our mission is by experimenting in ways of making people feel welcome. So experiment with new ways to greet customers. Experiment.
I love this word experiment.
Yeah.
Because I think it's so important to underscore that you probably won't get it right the first time, right? But it's all about checking what works, what doesn't work, learning from it, moving on.
Exactly. And that's at the heart of adaptive performance. And we think of experiments as they must be these big, grandiose things that take months to do. But we found that one of the most powerful ways to transform a culture is to help everybody just define what are the tiny little experiments they're going to run each week in the course of their day-to-day lives, in their existing meetings, in their existing work. One really fast-growing tech company we're working with, they've got about 200 people who last week alone ran 270 experiments on how they could improve their work. And that's bottoms up grassroots culture change. That's not a big mission statement on the wall. That's everyone learning adaptive performance and the value of tactical performance.
So can we stop here for a moment and stay with the experiments? Because I'm really interested in this topic, as a lot of our listeners as well. The reason that we called the podcast CultureLab is because we're big on experimentation. And I think I agree with you that this is the only way really that you can effectively shape and change culture. So what would you say is a recipe, if there is one, for a successful experiment?
It's a great question. So I got this wrong a lot. I'll share an example or story from our organization to illustrate it. About half of our company is engineers who are building technology to help to produce tools that help people create culture change in a more scalable way. And the other half of our organization are people that go out into the field and work with companies to help them transform. And what you would often find is that all of the great product ideas would come from the people who are out with companies, and they would just give orders to the engineers. That's the way it started in the beginning. And that's the way a lot of technology companies work, is you get orders from sales or a consumer experience person or a design, somebody who's out in the field, and the engineers are just sort of order takers. And as a result, what we found, and what a lot of companies found, is that since the engineers were shut out from the problem solving, the way that they started to problem solve and experiment, because it's human nature, was in all of these areas that weren't actually core to our customer. It was, let me test a new technology tool that's just come out, or let me redo how we've written this whole piece of code. That might be really interesting intellectual exercise for the engineer, but makes no difference to the customer. You essentially have an organization where you've got tons of experiments going on because people are chasing these shiny new things that are interesting to them, but not core to your strategy. And so the very first thing we realized in creating this culture of experimentation is how important it is to collectively define what are the most important challenges that we have to solve as a team. And so we use a lot of design thinking questions. How might we help our customer do this better? How might we help, make this part of our process easier to navigate? So every team really understands if we experiment in these 3 areas this month, that's going to be what's going to make a huge difference. So if that's one, if it's define the problem, the second is in the experiments. The next big thing has been making them truly collaborative, having processes around how teams solve them, making them tiny so you can do them in the course of your work. There's a ton here that you can tell I could talk for hours. But it's how do you make it part of your daily work as opposed to something scary and huge?
Totally, yeah. Because I think when you start talking about shaping or cultivating a culture, people feel like, oh my God, this is going to be over and above what I'm doing already, and I'm already so busy. So I find that as well, in my experience, it's really important to make it tiny, small, and part of people's daily work, because it's easier to move things forward. And then does it really matter what the outcome of the experiment is?
Great question. No, it does not. As long as you share what doesn't work and why. That's one of the biggest things we found, especially at large organizations, is, for example, I have a colleague who started out as my co-author, Neil, was an engineer back in 2000, and he went and at a big financial institution, and he went back to the same financial institution, and the team that he met was running the exact same experiment that he ran back in 2000, because there was no way that the team had shared and codified and scaled the learnings of what hadn't worked. And that's such a shame for organizations where you feel like every team is reinventing the wheel and not getting the benefit of past knowledge.
That's so true. All right. So going back to our conversation about performance, so you've identified these two types of performance, and you saw that what's important really is to keep both in balance. So you definitely need that tactical piece, but you also definitely need the adaptive performance. And another important area in your book that I think was really, really interesting for a lot of people to read about, and definitely for me, was around individual motivation. So I want us to talk a little bit about that. So why is understanding individual motivation so important when it comes to building a high-performance culture?
When we were trying to figure out what creates the highest levels of tactical and adaptive performance, we found out that it comes down to how you motivate people. And there is a very simple truth that it took me years and years and years to figure out, but everybody else says is very intuitive, which is that
it's always the case, isn't it?
Exactly.
Afterwards, everyone says, "Oh yeah, it's so intuitive," but
exactly. Yeah. Which is that why you work determines how well you work. So
why we work determines how we work.
Yeah. So your reason for doing anything is going to shape how well you do it. And it turns out that you can motivate people in pretty much any way you want to get the tactical performance, but there is only one particular way to motivate people to get both the tactical and the adaptive. And when you can create that, you get the really high performance culture.
So what is it? What is the way?
The secret is that, if you think about motivation, it actually falls on a spectrum from when you're working because you love the work itself to you're working for reasons completely disconnected to the work. And when you're motivating people by the work itself, on the left-hand side of that spectrum, you're going to get adaptive performance. And when you move to the right-hand side, you won't get it at all. So I can go through that spectrum for a little bit, if that's all right.
Yeah, definitely.
So when you're working because you love the work itself, that's play. So I don't know if you have any hobbies in particular.
Well, yeah, I do. We dance tango, so that's one. Yoga.
Very nice. So may I ask you if you're famous for your tango?
Definitely not even in my small town.
May I ask if you're paid for it?
No, I paid to be able to dance, actually.
So you pay a lot of money. So that's at the heart of play. You're not doing it because of some extrinsic reason. You're doing it simply because you love it. And the work itself, the work of tango, is something that you find curiosity in, joy in, flow, time flies by, you love learning new things. And you probably find that when you're doing it, you're constantly experimenting, even if you wouldn't give it that word. If you did the same dance in the same way over and over again, you get bored. But the reason you probably love it is because you can feel yourself constantly experimenting, growing, learning.
That's so true.
So if play is when you love the activity itself, the next motive is purpose. And this is when you're motivated by the outcome of the activity. So for example, if we had a teacher at play might love coming up with new lesson plans. And a teacher with purpose really cares about that moment when she can see a student's face light up because he's read a sentence by himself for the first time. And if we move further along the spectrum, we get to the third motive, potential, which is when you're working because of some second order outcome of the work. So at work, that usually looks like the job is a really good stepping stone. So our teacher may or may not have play or purpose, but they say, I really want to become a designer of curriculum or a textbook writer one day. And this job is a really good stepping stone for me to get there. The job doesn't exist to make her a curriculum developer, but that would be an indirect outcome of it. And these first three motives, play, purpose, potential, they're all connected to the work itself. And so they all drive up adaptive performance. But I can get into the ones that destroy it if you'd like.
Yes, definitely. We have to know them. It's important.
So the first one, I don't know if you've ever tried to get a loved one to do something using guilt.
Oh my goodness. Talk to my husband.
Please spill your secrets now.
I'll give you his phone number afterwards.
When we use guilt, we're using emotional pressure. So emotional pressure is when it's no longer do this activity because the activity has intrinsic value. It's do the activity because I'm applying this emotional pressure to you. I'm applying this external force of guilt or peer pressure or FOMO, right? With fear of missing out. I'm using that pressure to try and get you to do something. So, the teacher who says, my dad was a teacher, my grandfather was a teacher, so I need to be a teacher.
Right.
Next comes economic pressure. And this is when you're using sticks and carrots to get things done. So
you either get a bonus or lose a bonus if you don't do it, for example.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
And you're feeling really stressed because the reason you're doing this activity is because of something that's like a promotion or a bonus or a fear of getting fired. It's not the activity itself anymore. Yeah. And then the final motive, which is so disconnected from the work itself, is inertia. And this is when you're simply going through the motions because you've always gone through the motions. And so I don't know if you've ever had coffee with a friend and, that person isn't happy in their job. And you say, why are you still in that job? And the person says, I have no idea. That's
a relationship.
Exactly. Yeah. That's maybe more common.
Yeah.
But that is inertia. True. I mean, all of these motives you can apply to relationships. In fact, these motives are built off of a field of psychology called self-determination theory that started by looking at marriages and what makes marriages happy. And it's the ones that are around play, purpose, potential, and what makes students succeed in school. And they could measure the 6 different motives in students and predict which ones were going to drop out of school a year later.
Wow, that's powerful. So based on this spectrum and those 6 motives, you created something that is called ToMo. So talk to us a little bit about that. What is ToMo?
Yes. So ToMo is short for total motivation. I do have a friend named ToMo who will never forgive me.
Do you?
But I do. But it's short for total motivation. And what we found is that these motives behave so consistently across cultures, languages, countries. You can put people in an fMRI machine and study them. That you can create this single metric about what motivates people, where you add up the play, purpose, potential they feel, you subtract the emotional pressure, economic pressure, and inertia, and you get a ToMo score. And the higher your ToMo, the more likely we are to get amazing outcomes at work, and the more happy you will be with your culture. What was fascinating to us is that we could measure these, for example, in a sales force, and then go and change the ToMo of one sales team compared to another, and see the results in things like their sales, their customer experience, their engagement, their retention. And that all these motives weren't created equal. So when we do the math, the different motives have different weights. And I always assumed that purpose was going to be the most powerful, but it's actually not. Play is the most powerful. And then purpose, and then potential. And then they start to get destructive, with inertia being the worst.
This is so interesting, isn't it? That as we grow up, we sort of forget that this is our most powerful motive. But even, as you say, with grown-ups in the workplace, it turns out to still be the strongest thing that drives performance.
Exactly. It's why you gravitate towards in the day towards the things that you find most fun or most interesting. So for example, if you love problem solving on a whiteboard, you'll let that meeting go an hour late. But if you hate going through your accounts, you'll be looking at your watch every 5 minutes.
Totally. Yeah, that's so true. So thank you for sharing this idea with our listeners, because I think that people really find it, as you say, they find it very intuitive, and it's so easy to find so many examples from our lives where we saw how those three positive motives have a major positive impact on people's performance, and then how the other three are sort of constraining and don't deliver the same results. And I know that you've developed a tool that people can use to sort of measure what their ToMo is in their team and individually as well.
Yep, it's there's lots of deep ethnographic ways that you can measure it, but we were fortunate to learn that you could ask just 6 simple questions to measure somebody's ToMo. And so we've got on the website of our book, on primetoperform.com, some free surveys where you can measure your own ToMo. You can measure how much your own leadership style is driving ToMo up or down. And you can launch a survey for your team to understand their ToMo and what might be driving their ToMo up or down. And those results come back all anonymized so that you can have a team discussion about it.
Oh, that's fantastic. And it's available on your website free of charge, correct, Lindsay?
Yep, exactly,
yeah,
at primetoperform.com.
Yeah. So we'll post a link to that in the show notes as well, so that you can find it easily. I love the stories that you share about these motives and illustrating what can happen. And one of my favorite stories is around the Cobra Effect. So can you tell our listeners what happened to the cobras in India?
This is one of my favorite stories as well. It takes place in the 1800s in the city of Delhi in India. And there was a British government in the city of Delhi. And the British governors would be walking into work on occasion and turn a corner and stumble into a cobra, a snake. And not a nice thing. Right? When it's very different to see a little British garden snake versus something that can stand up and spit at you.
Yeah.
So the British decide, we've got to do something about this problem. So they do something they set up a program where they're going to pay a bounty for every dead snake that's turned in, right? Cash for cobras. Mm-hmm. And they set up their
financial pressure, basically.
Exactly. They set up their office of dead cobra receiving, and cobras start coming in by the bucket load, and it's a huge success. So, high fives all around.
Yeah.
And then they realized that some local entrepreneurs had started cobra farms. where
I love how you put it, some local entrepreneurs.
very clever, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's a very rational decision where they're farming the cobras. And of course, once the British realize this, they cancel the program. And the story goes that it wasn't worth the farmers' time to kill the snakes. So they released the cobras into the city. And Delhi has more cobras at the end of this than it did at the beginning.
Yeah. I love the story.
Yep. So, this is known as the Cobra Effect. And we see it in business all the time. Yeah, when you create an environment of very low ToMo, first people start to get distracted and stressed, and then they start to simply do the bare minimum. But the worst you can cause if you make it low ToMo enough is this maladaptive performance. Your tactical performance looks great, right? The dead Cobra dashboard was green. All the executives in the British government thought everything was going well, but they weren't getting adaptive performance. They were getting maladaptive performance that was completely against the spirit or the intention of the policy.
Yeah, totally. And I remember vividly a story from my earlier professional experience. I was working in sales in a cosmetic company. I'm not going to mention the name now. And I remember it was right before Christmas, and the company wanted to really make sure that we take advantage of that period with usually huge sales in cosmetics anyway. And we had some KPIs, surprise, surprise. And one of them was the average number of orders per representatives, retailers who are selling the products. And there was a goal set for our sales representatives to increase that particular KPI. So basically get more orders from our retailers. And as you can imagine, people did get that. They did achieve that goal, but the way they accomplished that was completely maladaptive, because basically what they did is they would receive orders from the retailers and then split them into smaller ones and then submit it to the company. So basically the company just spent more money on shipping the goods to the retailers. And it was completely ridiculous because the revenue was the same, but people got their bonuses at the end of that. So, yeah.
It's so true. And, it's such a great story. And what I love about it is that people will think that, the knee-jerk reaction of executives when they see something like that is, we hired a few bad apples. Like, I can just go fire a couple people and it'll fix the problem. But when you see situations like this, like in the US, the Wells Fargo fake accounts, or we've had cheating scandals where hundreds of teachers have done things. Volkswagen. It's people think it's a person issue and I've just got to fire the right people, but it's actually a really predictable outcome of a low ToMo culture. And so people don't connect that it's a cultural change they need to make rather than a personnel change.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so let's talk, and we did touch upon this already. Let's talk about how our listeners can build a whole culture that supports high performance and has a high ToMo.
Yeah, one of the things, the huge pressures or stresses that I used to feel as a leader was that I used to think that it was entirely upon me to motivate my team. And then I realized that my job was to create the conditions for people to motivate themselves. And I realized that I had a lot of levers in my tool belt to do that. And it wasn't just whether I was a nice person or could give a charismatic rallying speech. There's a lot more. When, as a leader or as the person responsible for building the culture in an entire company, whether that's 15 people or 50,000 people, we've learned that there's a lot of different levers that affect culture and ToMo. And the most powerful one is not actually whether you're a leader who uses the good motives or the bad motives, but how roles are designed. Have you set them up to be intrinsically high ToMo? And then how your talent system is working. Is it toxic and internally competitive, or is it inspiring learning and play? And how your teams work. Like, are you using agile processes in a way that drive ToMo up or down? You can actually measure the different systems in a company and how much they shape ToMo, or in a team, and start to change those. But if I was going to start anywhere, because transforming all the systems in your company will take years and can feel overwhelming, we found that in transforming an organization, there's a few very simple first steps you can take around giving people common knowledge and language, and then creating a culture of experimentation in a high ToMo way on teams that really can show results that are measurable and create a business case for this really, really fast.
Time for your questions.
Hi, Aga. This is Alison McTavish from Switzerland.
Hi, this is Dale Hintz. I'm submitting a question to the CultureLab.
Hi, Aga. I just want to say thank you so much for doing the podcast.
I have a question for CultureLab.
Hello, my name is Morten Abbey from Denmark.
Hi, Ed. This is Tim Coupler.
Hi, I'm Kostas. I have a question for you, Michael.
I'd love to hear your answer. Thank you.
Thanks for entertaining my question.
Hi, I'm Moaz Aladol. I'm an OD manager working in Saudi Arabia. Thanks, Aga, a lot for this podcast and the opportunity to connect us with such remarkable people. Hi, Lindsay. Thank you for being with us. I've been following you on Twitter since some time. So congratulations on the new baby. Actually, I have a zillion questions, but I'll try to reduce it to two if I can. My first question, according to Drucker, culture eats strategy for breakfast. But still, I don't see many C-suite executives speak about adaptive performance. Why MBA schools have more classes on strategy and very few on culture? What's going on? What's wrong in this? My second question, Lindsay, your book has been out since 4 years now. So what's next? What would you say differently if you're writing the book these days? Thank you so much, guys.
Oh, well, thank you, Rad, for those questions. They're great. To your first question around why aren't they taught in business schools, my hypothesis is that for so long, culture couldn't be measured, and we couldn't build a business case around it. So, for example, in one of my early days in the workplace, I was asked to think about the culture of this really fast-growing organization. And the leaders of the organization said, please, can you go fix the magic?
That's like a simple, straightforward task.
Exactly. And they said, and can you make the magic measurable so we can invest in it?
Love it.
And you couldn't. And so what we found is been so powerful once we sort of started to understand ToMo is that you could measure it and build a business case around it. So for example, when we've used it at hedge funds, you can say 10 points of ToMo is worth X million dollars to us every year. Or in retail front lines, X points of ToMo is worth this. And once you've got a business case and you can change things like culture and engagement from something that's correlation to causation, you can prove it, that you can change it and make a difference. That's, I think, when this whole field will gain the legitimacy to be taught in business schools and be treated as a science as opposed to simply a moral imperative, which it is, or a nice to have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's so true. So many guests who come on the podcast say the same thing, that actually before you can make a business case for culture, it's really difficult to have a meaningful conversation. And of course, even more difficult to change anything. But if you have some tools to really demonstrate that it's going to have an impact on the business, then people suddenly start getting interested and really invest in that.
Exactly. So to what I would do differently, or What have I learned since writing the book? One, if I were to write another book, I think this research applies so much to social change. When you see some of the most successful social movements, it's because they're often built on play and purpose and potential, not emotional pressure, economic pressure, and inertia. And when you see really successful government programs, it's not because they come from one political party or another. It's because they've created adaptive performance. They've enabled a society to adapt in a way that's really high ToMo for the people participating in it. So that's a huge topic of further research and exploration for me. And then,
it's incredible that you mentioned that, because I've just had a guest, Greg Sattel. I don't know if you're familiar with him. And he just had his new book released. It's called Cascades. And this is exactly what he talks about. So he tried to sort of decode successful social movements. And he talks a lot, actually, in the book about the importance of purpose and play and humor and stuff like that. So I think you might enjoy his book, actually.
I will have to check that out. I really look forward to that.
Yeah, it's really good.
And then the second thing I would say, if I could add one more, is where I find a ton of play is how do you make all of this culture change super, super easy? And so most of my life is spent on how do you build tools where we know that there's this incredibly talented group of people out there, like listeners on this podcast, who care deeply about this topic. My goal is that by 2050, every single organization in the world is high ToMo. And so how do I create the tools that make it super easy and simple for all the talent out there to just go implement this and learn from each other and scale their knowledge?
I love that. And I can only wish that you are successful in that, because our world would be so much different and so much better if, all the companies by 2050 would have high ToMo.
Well, there's a great community of people that I get to learn from and build off of their tools as well. So I'm glad that this is a big team working on this problem.
All right. So let's move on to the rapid fire questions now. I have 5 questions for you. I'll ask them in rapid succession, and we'll aim at answering all these questions in under 2 minutes. Are you up for it?
Sounds good. Yep.
Okay. So the first one is, how do you define organizational culture?
Culture to me, is anything that drives ToMo up or down. When you figure that out, you can build a great one.
Awesome. And what is the sign, or perhaps signs, that the company culture needs some work, or perhaps even a major overhaul?
When you ask people why they come to work every day, and none of their answers show any play, purpose, or potential.
And are there any companies that you admire for their culture?
Many organizations like Southwest, for example, is one of my favorite, where they've really understood that great cultures celebrate both tactical and adaptive. It's not just about the adaptive.
Yeah. And what books on culture or leadership would you recommend?
So many. One of my favorites at the moment is Liz Weissman's Multipliers, which is all about, as a leader, how do you get more out of your people than they ever thought possible.
And one last one. What is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow to build their own CultureLab and start cultivating a culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
Measure their ToMo. So, and then talk about it. One of the things that I found was so interesting is that we all believe that the people around us are motivated by those negative motivators. You're here because of the money or because of the prestige, but I'm here for the right reasons. And so as a leader, you have to practice talking about your why so that you can build that groundswell of support around you, that people understand what's truly motivating you at work.
I love that. Another question, not of the rapid fire series, but a question, a really selfish one for the podcast. Who would you recommend as the next guest on the podcast? I'm looking for people who have been successful in consciously and intentionally cultivating a culture that supports them in achieving a meaningful vision or for leadership experts, management thinkers, someone who has something really interesting to say about culture?
My favorite at the moment is Liz Weissman around multipliers. And another, I'm sorry, I've butchered his name, but yes, I would recommend Liz, and I'll send you more.
Thank you. So finally, Lindsay, would you like to leave our listeners with some final words, or let the audience know how to get in touch with you as well?
Absolutely. Easy ways to get in touch with me are through primetoperform.com and vegafactor.com. And my email is lindsay@primetoperform.com. There's lots of resources and tools there that can help you not only go deeper in your own personal learning journey, but teach this to others. So we're always happy to help. I think my parting words would be that when you look at so many of the challenges that we're facing as a society, and this goes back to the earlier question of what would the next book be, or how would you rewrite the book? Yeah. It's that as a society, we're all trying to learn how do we adapt faster in a way that doesn't have toxic implications. Mm-hmm. And you look at things like productivity getting lower, mental health suffering, innovation and creativity struggling, so many of the societal problems that we're struggling with and so many of the answers that we need can be answered through human psychology and being really thoughtful designers of the communities and the organizations that we pull together. And so the more that we as a community of people interested in this topic can share those success stories and share the shiny cities on the hill, that's what people need. There's a bunch of people that get this in their gut. There's a bunch of people that get this when we show them the numbers, but we need more and more examples from every single industry of how this works in that unique environment so that people really believe and really have hope that this is something they can achieve. You can achieve it in 6 months or a couple years. It's not something that we have to wait forever to accomplish.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for spending the time with us and sharing all your knowledge and these amazing stories. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed speaking to you, and I know that our listeners are going to love listening to this interview.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It's really a wonderful resource. So thank you, Aga.
I'm Aga Bayer, the creator and host of the CultureLab podcast, and this is the CultureLab team.
Production Manager, Lindsay Nunez.
Art Director, Emily Spencer.
Content Editor, Rachel Nice.
Sound Producer, James Eade, Be Heard.
If you haven't subscribed to the CultureLab podcast yet, you can do it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and many other places where podcasts are available. If you'd like to subscribe to my newsletter, The CultureLab Insider, go to www.agabayer.com/podcast. That's www.agabayer.com/podcast and scroll down to the very bottom of the page. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review the CultureLab. You can do it on iTunes or anywhere else that you listen to it. And before we say goodbye, I want to give you a preview of my next interview with Jeanette Brunet. Jeanette is an author, speaker, performance strategist, and culture coach. She helps leaders and companies rethink performance and culture by focusing on what she calls a culture of care. In this short preview, Jeanette talks about her AAA model that helps us to come out of the reaction mode, pause, and be more intentional and more grounded during our workday. Have a listen.
Basically, we need to create a culture where we can pause for a moment and just check in with ourselves, and so that we can think, engage, and act in a way that helps us move forward. And so one of the small tools is that we acknowledge That's the first A. We acknowledge how we feel right now by just checking in, thinking, how am I right now? What's going on? Then we accept the state of the union, so to speak. We accept the situation that's at hand. Instead of, oftentimes we're like, oh my God, I wish it wasn't this. Again, we're focusing on the wrong thing. But instead we accept the situation for what it is. And then we can ask, what do I need so that I can? And that's the act piece.
Thank you for listening to this episode of CultureLab. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share it with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared.